relationship between mining companies and the communities in which they find themselves working in is one of the critical areas that determines whether or not their activities are a success. Good relationships ensure profitability for the mining company, but also good well-being and sustainable development for those local communities. However, this relationship has to be maintained through constant, open and honest communication. Over the past 20 years, the concept that describes all of this has emerged called the social license to operate. And this argues that it is beyond just the legal permits and permissions, if you will, that determine the success of these activities. Joining us on the program today to discuss the social license to operate and the broader relationship between mining companies and local communities is Ambassador Andrew McAlister, the former High Commissioner of Canada to Tanzania and the current chairman of the McAlister Consulting Corporation. Ambassador McAlister, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
So this thing that we call the social license to operate, what is it really about?
Well, I think it applies mainly for extractive projects. I suppose you could apply it to any industry, but for various reasons, it's really become attached to the extractive industry, mining, oil and gas. And I think what it is designed to draw attention to is that really for extractive projects, there are two types of approval, two levels of approval. One is the formal official approval where a company wishing to do a project will make an application to the government, show that the project will be in full compliance with the law, regulations, environmental requirements, and so forth. And then the government will proceed to issue a permit, a legal permit. It's a legal document. But I think nowadays, most companies and most communities think that's probably not enough. That in order to undertake an extractive project in a given community, you really need to talk to that community. You need to have a relationship with them. You need to have a high quality partnership with them. And that's where the second level of approval comes about. It's really gaining community acceptance of the project. So there's the two levels of the official legal permit, and then the social license to operate comes in whether or not the project has a high enough degree of community acceptance.
Okay, and how do we know, that you have this social license to operate? I mean, it's not a legal document, as you said. So how do you gauge whether or not that's in place, as it were?
That's an excellent question. And it's a lot of people say, look, it's a lot easier to know when you don't have it than when you do. And I think that's true. I mean, it becomes pretty quickly apparent when you don't have a social license to operate. And many communities these days are rightly concerned about how the non-renewable resources in their areas are being exploited. And if they're not happy with how a company is conducting itself, they can very easily obstruct the project. And I think that's something that companies are well aware of now and want to take great care to ensure that they have a social license to operate. How do you do that? I think it's mainly through a structured, regular consultation with the host communities. And a kind of consultation that begins before your first vehicle rolls up to the projected site. You begin a process of consultation with the local communities, host communities, and that process should continue through exploration, through feasibility, through construction, through the production phase, and even right up to closure. There should be a constant structured dialogue. And I mean structured because it needs to be done in a very, almost a semi-official way, in my view, that you have regular interactions, regular channels for interaction. You have a grievance mechanism that works well, so the communities feel aggrieved. There's a mechanism they have for taking it up with the company concerned, which is effective, timely, and if necessary, confidential, depending on the nature of the complaint. So I think that the way a company will know if it has a social license to operate is if the quality of its relationships is high. And what some companies have decided to do is go out and get third-party verification of that. So they have brought in experts to go and test the quality of the relationship and then report back to the company and report to the communities as well on how good the relationship is and how well it's functioning.
If I can just ask maybe a technical question, what is the difference between, say, the social license to operate and what we sometimes hear of as, corporate social responsibilities? Are these the same thing, or is there a difference here?
I think the social license to operate is much, much broader than corporate social responsibility. I think that the social license to operate should be viewed more in the context of risk reduction. It's something that companies should engage in order to reduce the risk to their investment. Companies are very good at technical assessment of risk or assessment of commercial risk. I think they are learning about social risk. One of the ways that they can improve their partnership is through corporate social responsibility, but I think the social license to operate concept is much, much broader. It covers environmental practices, it covers respect for local culture, respect for local languages. So I think it's a broader concept. I mean, CSR is usually considered to consist of activities such as investment in social infrastructure. But I think SLO is much, much broader and has to do with a much broader range of issues and a much broader relationship with the communities.
Sure. And where has this idea come from? I mean, it's something that seems to have gained traction, quite recently. Mm-hmm. So maybe one question, why has it come up and where from?
The first time I ever came across that term was it was from a Canadian, actually, by the name of Jim Cooney, a very well-respected mining executive, who observed that there were projects which were being disrupted by communities. And he thought it was very important to drill more deeply into the reasons why a community would obstruct a mining project, for example, block a road or engage in labor action or express concern to the media. I mean, there are a number of ways in which a local community can negatively impact a project. And his view was that companies were running unnecessary risks if they failed to assess the situation in which they were going to work and the community in which they were going to work. And so Jim coined that phrase, I think back in 1997, initially in a meeting with the World Bank. And then the World Bank took up that expression, took up the term, social license to operate. And since then, it's gained a lot of currency. And I think virtually every company now in the extractive sector will say that they have a social license to operate. But as I mentioned, it's sometimes pretty difficult to know whether you do or not. And as I said, I think companies have decided that they need to go to third-party verification just to make sure that they have a social license to operate. So it's become quite a commonly accepted term, referring to what you need to do over and above the legal requirements to undertake and operate an extractive project.
Sure. It might sound a bit of a downer type of question, but how can this concept be abused? I mean, it's great that it builds a relationship between that kind of mining industry, the government, and the community, and therefore allows for operations. But maybe the first question: can it be abused? And I'm going to guess it can. And in what ways does that abuse kind of manifest?
Well, I think it can be abused. I mean, social license to operate, if you have one, it doesn't mean that you have unanimous support in a community. I think that would be an unattainable standard. I don't know that there's a single project in the world which would enjoy unanimous support in the community. Normally, there will be people who will support a project and people who will be against a project. That's normal in every country of the world, including in Canada. There are people who are opposed to extractive projects. Some people don't believe in mining, don't believe in resource extraction. Some people are unhappy with the way it's being done. Some people are unhappy because they or their family didn't get jobs, or they and their families didn't get local procurement contracts. There's a whole variety of motivations as to why some people say, you don't have a social license to operate. So I think it is open to abuse on that side. It's also open to abuse on the company side, where, as I say, companies can say yes and put it in their annual report and report to their shareholders, we have a social license to operate, but I think you need to drill in more deeply. And as I say, one of the most effective ways of doing that is through third-party verification. Get some real expertise to come in and assess the relationship that you have. So it can be abused. I mean, I think it's not meant to give an individual or a small group of people a veto, saying, look, you can't do this project because I don't agree with it. I think that's not the idea of a social license to operate. I think it does raise a lot of questions of governance in the local community. What are the power relationships in the local community? Just because you have a handful of people who say they object to a project, are they representative? And that's where a company needs to have a very deep knowledge of that community, what the power relationships are enough voices being heard? Are some voices being suppressed? I talked earlier about a structured process of consultation. Do the consultations include people whose voices might not normally be heard, such as women or young people or people living with disabilities or ethnic minorities? I mean, it's important to design that consultation so that all voices are heard, and then you get a much better feel for whether those objecting to a project are really representing broader opinion in the community, or do they have their own particular individual interests, and that's what's motivating them to oppose a project.
But if I were to say, view it from the perspective of a government, does the fact that an SLO is needed speak to a shortcoming in either my relationship with that community or the kind of frameworks that I have in place? Because this seems like almost a paralegal. It's outside the law, and yet it can prevent a perfectly legal activity from taking place. Is that something that we should be concerned with?
I think the short answer is yes. I would be very concerned about that. I mean, is it? Let's say if there's a working democracy in the country concerned, and let's say that the government of that country has decided that this company meets the required standards and grants the permit, how democratic is it then to say, well, wait a minute, you can't? I mean, even though the elected representatives have endorsed a permit, let's say, but we don't live in a perfect world. If we did live in a perfect world, that would be the case, but we don't. And often there are cases where the local situation's a little bit different. The national government may not have a really good grasp of the local situation. There may be very legitimate concerns in the local community. One way that companies have dealt with that issue is to broaden the impact assessments that they do. Everyone does environmental impact assessments, and they do them, I mean, most companies do them quite well, and they do noise, dust, vibration, water quality, impact on vegetation, and so forth. But in recent years, that whole EIA, environmental impact assessment, has been broadened by some companies to include social impacts. And I think that allows you to get at issues like impact on the local economy, potential for inflation, effect on footpaths, bicycle paths, access to markets, access to healthcare. I mean, access to or impact on culture, because in some mining projects, for example, you'll have a lot of in-migration from other parts of the country, or even from other countries across borders. So there can be impacts on culture, too, that must be assessed. And I think that the more progressive companies have realized that, and they include social aspects of impact in their social and economic impact assessments. And I think that more enlightened governments are increasingly demanding that impact assessments include social aspects. And that, I think, helps you to identify actual or potential problems before they occur, and to deal with them through your risk mitigation, risk reduction, risk mitigation strategies. You try to deal with, say, the impacts of in-migration, or you try to deal with relocation, which is always a highly sensitive matter. So I think that you're right. To come back to your question, you're right that there is a risk there that people will not respect a decision that has been made through the legal processes. But if they won't do that, I think you need to assess why that is. And then that, ideally, your assessments and your knowledge of the local community will help you to come up with some answers and some solutions to that issue.
And I suppose by extension, hypothetically, it sounds a bit conspiratorial, but could the social license to operate actually go too far in a sense, whereas the community will side with, say, a business instead of its government for whatever reason? Is that also a possibility, or is that now really just kind of a hypothetical situation?
It does happen.
Okay.
I've seen it happen. Mm-hmm. Where, for example, I don't want to name names here, but sure. On relocation. Mm-hmm. Now, most governments have in place standard procedures for relocation, mm-hmm. and they have standard compensation schedules. So people are relocated get compensated for their houses and for their crops and for any other physical assets which they have, and then they are helped to resettle and reestablish in a neighboring community or so on. In some cases, the relocation regulations and compensation schedules are badly out of date. Mm-hmm. And some governments are concerned that some companies might overcompensate people and create precedents that they don't want by providing too much by way of relocation compensation. So I have seen that, and that is a risk, and I think a company needs to assess that pretty carefully. On the other hand, I think that governments have an obligation to ensure that the relocation regulations and compensation schedules remain up to date, realistic, and fair. And that's not always the case today, but I think most governments are increasingly aware of the need to keep those things current.
In your opinion, do you think this concept of the social license, is it here to stay, or is this something that we're experiencing because of a kind of transition in the way that we have expectations of our governments, of our extractive sector, of good corporate citizens, and so on, or is this now the kind of modus operandi going forward? Do you think this is more of a transitional issue, or?
I think it's going to be around for quite a while. I don't think I think the days are gone when a company can go up to a site with its mining permit in hand and say, we're going to mine here because we have a right to, and we're going to, we've got the permit, we've got the piece of paper which enables us to mine here. Without interaction with the prior interaction with the local community. I think those days are gone. I think, too, that with the advances in information technology, the host communities are very interconnected. I think you can go into quite remote areas and you'll find a high level of awareness amongst community leaders about what are realistic expectations they should have of an extractive project. And the day when you could go and exploit a resource and nobody in the outside world would know about it, those days are long gone.
Social media as well.
Yeah, of course. And the communities are very highly connected with like-minded communities and civil society in other parts of the country, but internationally as well. And so I think companies are well aware of that and realize that they must handle these issues with great care. And I think it'll be with us for a long time.
Okay. And I mean, you've mentioned this idea of consistent, structured dialogue, communication between all the parties. What are some of the other kind of key principles of good SLO practice for everyone concerned? what really do we want to see? What are the fundamentals? What are the basics? What should be in place to ensure that A, you get it, and then B, that you keep it?
Yeah. Well, I think that the structured dialogue is critically important. A properly done impact assessment that's not just put on a shelf, but is an active part of the management plan. It's not a document that you say, well, look, we've ticked that box. The social environmental impact assessment needs to be an active document, needs to be part of the management plan, and needs to have key performance indicators all the way down the road to make sure you keep it on track. And again, keep coming back to the idea of third-party verification, which I think is extremely important. As a rule of thumb, I think that no company should do in a host country what it would not do in its home country. I think that's a really good rule of thumb. And if a company finds that standards can maybe around environment, for example, are in a host country are weak or not enforced, the company has a duty to ensure that it is in compliance with the highest local standards, or if they're absent, in compliance with international standards. So I think some of it's common sense. To me, it's common sense that you just don't behave differently in another country. You behave in a way that respects international norms and standards, whether they're codified or not in local law, and you operate with respect for other people. And I think those are some of the key principles that a responsible company will adhere to.
Sure. And then as a kind of final thought, what key takeaway or what key message would you want people to take away from this interview about the social license to operate and what it's really about and why it's so important as a kind of parting shot, as it were?
I think extractive projects are especially sensitive. That's one takeaway, because what a company is doing is it's taking out non-renewable resources. I mean, when those resources are gone, they're gone. And so a community has only one opportunity to benefit from the exploitation of those resources. And I think it's very important for foreign companies in particular to understand that and to realize that local leaders at whatever level must be able to stand up before their people and before their constituencies and explain why it is that this company has been allowed to come in and develop that resource. And this is something which I think companies are learning more about. I think 10, 20, 30 years ago, companies would have come in and done their business and said, well, that's not our business. Well, I think it is their business. It's their business to have constant interaction with the leadership and also to ensure that local leaders will have adequate, accurate information about what the company is undertaking, what the benefits are, and what the impacts are. And so that the political leaders will be able to face their constituencies and explain things to them in a way that's accurate and reliable.
On that note, unless you have something you particularly want to add.
Thank you. Well, I think it's been very complete, and I appreciated the questions very much.
Sure. And welcome back to the program another time.
Thank you very much.
Care to join us.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks so much.